All right, Mr. Spore here, biology class, ecology, part two. Okay, we're going to be talking about the flow of energy today in the universe, or mainly here on Earth, and how that relates to life. A couple of assignments going to be posted along with this. So we have the notes page, the usual suspect here. Fill this out following the lecture, following the presentation. And the more room that I give you per question, the more I'm kind of hoping you will fill in that space with details. So make sure you're writing in complete sentences, use capitals, start your sentences and things like that. Make it super beautiful for me. Would you do that, please? And include as many details as you can. Of course, the number of points kind of indicate how long of an answer I want you to give. So this last one here, when I say explain, and then it's a 3-point question, I really want you to use this diagram, reference it, talk about some things we talked about in the notes, and really kind of lay out the case. So I expect at least several sentences, 3 sentences or so, in there, kind of explaining and backing up your claim with some evidence. Right on, right on. The other assignment I will have varies depending on the course you're in. If you're in honors biology, I have a article on primary production and another Google Doc that goes along with that you'll fill out. And if you're in general biology, I think I might post a video. I'm not quite sure yet what I'll have for you guys, but I'll have another assignment posted there under week 2. All right, let's get this party started, shall we? Sun just came out, so I ran outside. I wanted to film this one out in the yard because we're talking about ecosystems in nature, and I'm out in nature. All right, ecology, part 2, the flow of energy. Really, the question we're trying to answer here is, how does energy move through an ecosystem? If we remember from the very beginning of biology, all living things are made of cells. And all cells require some source of energy and use energy. Some use more energy faster than others, some slower, but all cells do require some source of energy. And so we need to look at where that energy comes from and how it moves through ecosystems. And there'll be a lot of applications to this when we get towards the end that you'll see when it comes to understanding populations and things like that. So just to review, in ecology, when we're talking about ecology, we're talking about the interactions of living things with each other and with their physical environment as well. So it's not just one interaction, it's this really web of interactions. Next week, when we talk about biotic interactions, we'll see that really shape species over time and control the amount of species in an area and control the number of species within those populations as well. So all of these interactions shape the living biological world around us, and it's what makes ecosystems different from one another and unique as well. And what is an ecosystem? Well, an ecosystem is a community of organisms, so that means many different populations, right? The plants and the animals, we got 2 different populations here, horned puffins and crested auklets, and then even the underwater communities, right? And those are different because what separates different communities are the physical abiotic environments. So the rain, the amount of water, the type of water, the temperature, the nutrients, the availability of nutrients and things like that, the soil, and also just the amount of light energy that is in that ecosystem. These all shape communities and make them distinct, right? The difference between an ecosystem here in Western Oregon on the coast and Eastern Oregon over by Bend, Oregon is really those abiotic elements, right? So you couldn't just take a plant community here and throw it over in Bend. It would dry up. And similar, a ponderosa pine sagebrush community would just probably mold over here. It's so wet. So those physical abiotic forces shape communities and really drive the type of ecosystem that you're going to find in that particular region. Okay, so every ecosystem here on Earth starts out with some type of producer or autotroph. If you're in the ocean, that can be plankton, but us being land creatures and me filming this here on land, we'll talk about plants, right? Mainly as our example. And most texts and most, when you talk about ecology, we always think about plants as being at the bottom. But plants are really producers or autotrophs. And what they do is they're organisms that make their own chemical energy out of physical energy. They take the sun's electromagnetic radiation, which is physical energy from the universe, right? It's produced by stars, and they take that energy and they convert it. They convert it through a process called photosynthesis, and they capture that energy and store it in the bonds between different atoms, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, or carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, know your CHO. And they build sugar out of this. So they do this through a process called photosynthesis. Photo referring to photons, and the synthesis meaning to make, and what they're making out of photons is sugar, right? So they already have these elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, around them. It's carbon dioxide, it's in the air, it's a gas, and it's water, which is either a solid, liquid, or gas around us. So they access it usually in a liquid form, and they build up sugar molecules out of this. And this is the start of every ecosystem. And you can see this from space. When you look down, you see producers, right? The number one type of organism here on Earth are autotrophs and producers. They outnumber everything 10 to 1. And we'll talk about why that is later on. But that's an important sort of concept. And 10 to 1 is not something I'm just spitting out. That's an actual ratio. And the reason being, well, we'll get into that. But when you look down from space, you can see that. You can see trees. When you look off in the distance out your window, you see hills covered in trees and forests and plants, right? You don't see them just covered in bears and ants. That would be terrifying. Would never want to land on that planet. So it's nature is really started, and then the basis of it is all producers and autotrophs, and they're the most numerous thing on this planet. And basically because they can just make their own food. Pretty cool trick. If you look around a map of planet Earth where most production is, so on land, it's the dark green, is where your highest density of primary producers and primary production is taking place. And in the tan areas, there's hardly any taking place on land. So you can really see your deserts, right? You've got the Sahara and the South African desert. But in the middle here, you have the Congo Basin, which is a rainforest. You have the Amazon Basin, the world's largest continuous forest. You have the northern tundra up in here, the taiga forest, if you will, that runs all the way across Eurasia and upper North America down into Canada, over in this part of Canada. And this is where most of your producers are. This is where most of your photosynthesis is taking place, and this is where the highest density of life would be. Now in the ocean, it follows a similar trend. It's near the equator where there's a lot of nutrients, but it's actually in the north and the south where your oceans are the most productive. And out in the middle of the ocean, you don't find a lot of production. And it's mainly because out in the middle of the ocean here, you lack nutrients, right? So this essential element, this abiotic factor that shapes ecosystems is lacking here. The ocean's about 12,000 feet deep on average out in the middle of the ocean basins, and all the nutrients have been used up or sunk by the time they get out here. So the nutrient source is usually land, and it washes off, and then it gets carried out across in currents right here. You got the trade winds carrying out nutrients. But out in here, you don't have a lot of wind, so there's not a lot of transport. And again, if nutrients are on their way out here, they're getting used up by plankton along the way. And so there's no plankton production. These are what we call marine deserts. And sailors used to say that you knew you were getting near land when you were sailing across the ocean, when you started to see life. Because the minute you get to this production density areas where there's a lot of plankton, then you get a lot of the next thing we're going to talk about, which are consumers. So the next level up, right? Every ecosystem starts with producers. You have to have those. You have to produce something in order to consume it, like economics almost. So the next level up above the producers are then the consumers, and we call those heterotrophs. They feed on something else. Hetero means other, and troph means food or feeding. So producers we call autotrophs. Auto meaning self. They self-feed. These guys have to feed on something else. So these are organisms that obtain their energy from other organisms. And heterotrophs include microorganisms, small things, but they also include, well, they mainly, when we think of them, include animals and fungus, and then, of course, we got some of the microbes like protistas, bacteria, and archaea. The animal kingdom is solid consumer, and the fungal kingdom is solid consumer. Every member of these groups is a heterotroph, an obligate heterotroph. They have to get energy from somewhere else. They are not producers. Plant kingdom are producers. So, consumers, yeah, belong to the following kingdoms, and we have some examples down in here you can kind of see, right, in case you needed this to be circled on this one. The sun is neither a producer nor a consumer because it's not a living thing, right? It is an abiotic thing. It is a non-living physical thing in the universe. When we talk about living things, we're going to talk about either producers or consumers. Plants are producers, and then the next level up, you get consumers here. And we can break consumers into different groups as well. people do that, and we'll talk about that actually in the next section. We'll talk about how we break consumers up and where they fit as far as interacting with each other goes. So bringing it all together, right? All living organisms require a constant supply of energy to stay alive. And there's two ways to get that energy, right? The energy source for everything is the sun here on Earth. The sun provides almost all the energy for living things here on Earth. There's few chemoautotrophs, and we're not going to talk about those, but they do their production through metabolizing these kind of complex chemicals at the bottom of the ocean. Don't worry about it. Source for energy here on Earth, sun, right? And the thing that takes advantage of that are producers' autotrophs. So they make their food. There's two ways to get energy. You either make it or you take it, right? So producers make their own energy. They make glucose, C6H12O6, out of sunlight. They photosynthesize it. They take photons and they synthesize, they make glucose. Consumers are organisms that get their energy from something else. They eat the producers, and there's less of them. There's less of them here on Earth. We forget plants because they're just everywhere, right? If you look around me right now, down on the ground, everywhere around me, I am just surrounded by producers out of the back over here. It's all producers that you see. It is all producers. It's all autotrophs all around me. I'm surrounded by living things, right? Really, the only consumer you see here is me. Now, if I dig around, I'm going to find bugs, and you can hear the birds singing back there. But again, completely outnumbered by producers because there's just much more energy available to them, right? They're just eating the sunlight, which is kind of half blinding me out here in the yard. Okay, so ecology is all about interactions between living things. And one of the main interactions is consumerism, right? When consumers eat or predate on things. And we call this predation. Doesn't matter if you're eating plants or not, you're still a predator. You're just preying on a different kingdom. That's all it is, right? But it's just still all just life, basically. And food chains and food webs show which consumers, right? They show the interactions, basically, or the levels of predation between organisms in an ecosystem. They really show the flow of energy through an ecosystem. Don't just think about it about who eats who. Look at it as a flow of energy through an ecosystem. It always starts with the producers. So over here, our producers are either corn, carrots, or grass in this example. And then your first level consumer, what we call herbivores generally, they're going to be eating those. Now, interestingly enough, we think of herbivores as being things like rabbits or maybe mice or deer. Most herbivores on land actually belong to the insect group. 80% of all animals are insecta anyway. And they're the most numerous consumer here. Most of the birds you're hearing around me would be one level up where the frog is. Most of these guys eat insects. A few of them eat seeds and stuff, and they're out here singing right now. They migrated all the way from Central America to take advantage of when the leaves start to pop in the trees and everything starts to grow and it becomes springtime and you have to mow your lawn twice a week. That really boosts the insect population. The insect population escalates dramatically here, and birds fly from all the way from another continent, all right, all the way from South America up here just to take advantage of that every year in season, which is kind of cool. So food chains and food webs show who eats who in this whole mix, and really they're showing the flow of energy beyond that. They're showing where the energy goes and who passes it on. So food chains are just a linear kind of going from one to the other, showing, basically starting with one single producer all the way up to a consumer, and they show how they're linked. But a food web is a little more intricate and a little more explanatory, I suppose. And you may think of these as being something that you do just in middle school, but these are actually really important. And ecologists and biologists, we will diagram these out, actually. They'll be in a lot of our manuals. We'll have a food web in there that shows the interactions. Each single food chain goes from producer on up to various levels of consumers until we get to the end, and we'll talk about why it ends. But each of those is kind of just a kind of pulling a thread out of something that is actually a complex web. And when you overlay them, then you get this complex web of multiple food chains interacting with each other, and you see which organisms play the most crucial roles in these ecosystems. So in here, one of the central figures to all of this is a copepod, and copepods are linked to almost every other organism in here. So if you pull out one of these central ones, like a copepod, you can see a complete collapse in the food web above it, including things like marlin or sharks. And the copepods are tiny. You need a microscope or at least a magnifying glass to see them. They're a type of zooplankton. They're about a millimeter in size or smaller. So easy to miss, and probably the most numerous animal on planet Earth. True story. They blanket the world's oceans and they eat phytoplankton. You pull one of these out and this whole thing can collapse. And you may be wondering, why are there no more tuna fish coming along the shore? Why are the runs really slow? Even why are the salmon runs slow? Why are shark numbers in big declines? On and on and on. And it may link all the way back down to something affecting the copepods, and that could be water temperature, that could be acidity change in the ocean, that could be some type of pollution or global patterns in winds and currents shifting and all of these things. And we would see major seabird population die-offs, and seabirds eat things like squid up in here. And or lanternfish, let's say. But we would see seabird populations every now and then just crash completely. Birds wouldn't show up to the cliffs, or birds would come but not lay eggs. Maybe they would lay eggs but then abandon all their nests after 2 weeks, and we just have all these dead eggs everywhere and be like, what the heck is going on? And we'd find out that copepod populations were incredibly low that year. They had crashed. Temperature had risen. Surface currents had shifted, driving the copepods really deep in the water so birds couldn't get to the fish that were eating the copepods. Pretty interesting stuff. Pretty dramatic effects across ecosystems. So food webs help us understand that. Okay. And this is the typical sort of food web. This is an example. It's a photograph I took over at East School that one of the classes had done. I think about a 6th grade class had done this. And so you'll see, again, the connections. And you look for that central species. I was just talking about copepods. On land, what is the organism here that everything is connected to, that if you pulled it out, we call them keystone species. You know, you got this big brick wall, and there's a few bricks you can move out of there, no big deal. Picture it like a Jenga game. But there's one piece. If you pull that thing out, the whole thing crashes. What is that keystone species? What is that one brick you can't really pull out, or you should be very careful of? And in this case, it actually looks like caterpillars, right? Caterpillars are intricately linked, and that link goes all the way up to things much larger than them as well. And so, again, these insects, and I'm surrounded by all these singing birds, and they're here because of little things like caterpillars showing up in the trees right now. It's primarily what they're feeding on. So super important. And things like pesticides, the pesticide may not directly kill something like a bear, but it may have a large impact on larger animal populations, and maybe not like this year, but maybe in a couple years you see these things start to roll out. And we've seen this especially in the Midwest, where there's a lot of agriculture and there's a lot of spraying that goes on. We'll see populations of other organisms higher up in the food chain several years later just completely plummet and crash. Okay. So in a food chain or food web, the different levels are called trophic levels. So trophic means food or nutrients or nourishment in this case. And so, the first trophic level is always primary producers. Always primary producers. Doesn't matter if it's plants or in the ocean, it can be plankton. These dinoflagellates or diatoms, phytoplankton. Could be algae in an ocean setting as well, along the shoreline, or in a freshwater system like a lake or a river. Algae plays an important role in that river system. For all the little aquatic insects that are going to eat those, the grazers and the scrapers, and then that feeds up into your baby salmon even. So each level is a trophic level, and in order to understand what is going on in an ecosystem, you got to kind of understand how trophic levels are structured, and that's what we're going to look at next. First trophic level, again, is always autotrophs, or primary producers. So in this example, I like how it shows you both. It shows you on land plants, but in water it is mainly phytoplankton, and that is a type of primary producer as well. Producers convert light energy, electromagnetic radiation, physical energy into chemical energy, glucose, and that kicks off the party, right? Now we got a food chain party, baby. Okay, so you got to have those there. That first trophic level is always some type of a primary producer in an ecosystem. The second trophic level we call primary consumers. It gets confusing because now you've got two primaries, although you're on your second level, and then you'd have secondary consumers, but that would be on your third trophic level. I don't know why. I don't know why they got to make it confusing. So I don't really have us worry about that. But the second trophic level is always starts with heterotrophs or consumers. Generally, we consider those herbivores or grazers, and they play a crucial role in transferring nutrients into forms available to other things as well. I can't eat grass. I could, but it's not going to do much. But I could eat bugs. Gross, but I could if I had to survive. If I was just to sit out here and try and chew grass, you'd see me 4 weeks later and I'd weigh 70 pounds and wouldn't be much going on there. But if I was to dig around and eat bugs, I could stay pretty fit. What? Birds are talking behind me. Okay, consumers at the second trophic level are herbivores, like I just talked about. And then on up, you get omnivores, carnivores, scavengers, decomposers. We'll talk about that next week. So this brings us all to this major point, and kind of where I want this to land, is understanding this flow of energy through systems. We've named things, we've talked about food webs, we've talked about why things are important at certain levels, but what is the maximum number of trophic levels you see here? What is the maximum number of levels? Again, the sun is not one. So maximum number of trophic levels, we'll go for first trophic level, your producer, second trophic level, your herbivore, primary consumer, third trophic level, fourth trophic level, fifth trophic level, 5. If we want to count around in here, we can get a few more transfers. We go 1 trophic level, 2 trophic level, 3 trophic level. We can cut over here 4 trophic level. Then it jumps up to 5th, then 6th, maybe 7. Maybe 7. The ocean is the most rich and complex ecosystems on Earth are in the ocean. And it's funny because we'll classify land into like grassland and desert and biomes and break it up in these colorful maps and then we just go ocean. But you can do the same with the ocean. You can break the ocean up into all of these different marine biomes, but really different ecosystems. Coral reef ecosystems vary, a lot. And then there's all these different temperate ecosystems. On and on and on, deep and shallow and coastal and estuarian. Okay. Ocean's the most complex and it can have the most trophic levels, more than land. But even at its highest, you're still getting 6, 7 trophic levels, max. So why? Why aren't there 15? Why doesn't this go on and on and on and on and on? The wrong answer, some of you are going to give me on the note sheet is that nothing is big enough to eat a shark. It's not necessarily true or accurate. There could be. There was a megalodon at one point. They actually, their population went extinct around 2 million years ago, and that coincides with ocean levels shrinking 300 feet globally because of the Ice Age, and that greatly reduced the food webs around the planet and shrunk them because you lost those shallow coastal seas where all that production was, and they think that they starved out. So, okay, so you could get something bigger. It's not that nothing is bigger. It really has to do with why do you only have 5 or 6 trophic levels? Why don't you have 15, 16? Why are there more in the ocean than on land? So this is a really important one to understand. This is the whole key concept of this lesson, really, is building us to be able to understand that, to have the tools to be able to understand that. So lock in. Why? The energy comes from the sun, and then it is harnessed by producers. Everything after a producer, though, is a what? Consumer? So if you're a consumer, you're consuming energy. You're using it. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it sure can be used. And it's used in all kinds of ways. I'm using energy right now. I'm using it to talk to you. So I'm producing sound, I'm moving around, and that is requiring energy from my cells. And that energy is going out as sound waves. It's coming out as motion, as kinetic energy. It's coming out as heat, metabolic energy in me. And heat is then dissipating into the universe. So as I consume a cold apple, I actually burn it off as hot fuel like a furnace. So energy is being used. It's being consumed. It's being consumed at the first consumer level, the second, the third, the fourth. Consumed and consumed and consumed and consumed. It's only produced at the bottom. So eventually, you run out of energy. And the best way to show this is through energy pyramids. So energy pyramids, it's not like a food pyramid. This is an energy pyramid. And these are used in ecology all the time. And we can stack organisms into them. And we can use the math that is kind of modeled here in deeper equations to help us understand how much we need to provide at each level to maintain a population. So let me back that up. Energy pyramids show the relationship between the amount of energy and each trophic level. So they show you how much energy is at each level. Sun's energy comes in at the bottom and producers produce energy. So we're going to give that 100%, right? 100% energy acquisition. This is where your ecosystem is at 100% of its energy is right here. So we start with this, right? We start with looking around me and going, this is what's available. This is what's being produced. And now let the consumption games begin. And so organisms are going to jump in and start doing that. They're going to start playing the consumer game. At that first consumer level, primary consumers, out of 100%, what is available to the next level up? So that's what we're going to look at here. And this will tell us how many consumers we can have at each level. Do the math. What percentage moves up, looking at this little blue chart down here? Or looking right here, what percentage of energy is transferred at each level? And then what percentage of energy is consumed at each level, right? So energy is consumed, it is used in metabolic processes for growth, and it is lost as just heat, right? Which is kind of a wasteful form of energy. As mammals, we're pretty inefficient. As I eat food, I burn off a lot as heat. We're warm-blooded, but that allows, big organisms like ourselves to react swiftly as well because we got a higher body temperature. Insects are more efficient. But on average, in an ecosystem, what amount of energy is transferred up? And we can measure energy either by a biomass. I could measure the pounds of grass that is produced in this yard, and then I can measure the pounds of insects that are living off of it and eating it. And you can get a percentage, a ratio. Or we can measure it in calories that are available as well, kilocalories. So energy is passed up the food chain from one trophic level to the next. So energy is being passed up from the producers, and then it's just consumed. So if I'm consuming something, I'm not passing to you what I got. I'm passing to you what I have left because I've been consuming things. I hope that makes sense. So producers produce the energy and everybody else consumes it. And when a primary consumer, like a grasshopper, eats grass, it's using that energy to hop around and do its thing, right? And live its life. So if something comes along and needs the grasshopper, it doesn't have all the energy that the grasshopper originally had. It only has a fraction of that because the grasshoppers used that energy. Oh, it's only about 10% of the total energy stored in organisms is actually transferred to the organisms at the next level. Only about 10% of the calories are available. So if there's 10,000 calories of grass, 10%, right? Just divide things into tenths, right? Divide by 10. That's what 10% is. So only about then 1,000 calories of grasshoppers will be supported by that biomass, right? Now only support that much. And then for birds eating those, when the birds come down, there may be 10,000 calories of grass around them, but if birds don't eat grass and they eat grasshoppers, there's only about 1,000 calories of grasshoppers. A 10-to-1 ratio. There's 10 times more producers than consumers, generally. So 10% is transferred to the next level. Why are there only 4 or 5 trophic levels in each ecosystem again? Because energy is, and you can see it on this diagram, it's either used or it's lost. So there's only that much because at each trophic level, 90% of all the energy is used for metabolic processes, like cell division, like growth, like movement, right? Reacting, responding to your environment, like moving around to get food to consume in the first place. It costs calories to get calories. And when we get into competition next week in ecosystems, competition is always a loss for both parties involved. Even if I win the competition, I still lost because I had to spend more calories than I would have if I hadn't competed at all. Just to walk up and grab a burger and eat it is a bigger win than if I have to, right, arm wrestle you to see who gets to eat the burger, right? Because now I've spent calories on arm wrestling even if I win. So 90% of the energy is used just for life, for competition, for access, for moving around, for just growth, for every other thing. So I eat 1,000 calories in a day. By the end of the day, I maybe only have 100 calories left over in my body physically because I burned off about 900 of those, right? 90% of those. So at each level, boom, 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 energy is consumed and used up. Where you start with 100% energy, right? If you only have 10% left, then you only have 10% left. Okay, so 10% of 100. Just 10%. And then if you have 10% of 10, well, it's only 1% left. So now we've just gone up two trophic levels. We just traded 2 times, and now we're down to 1%, right? So if this was 100 pounds, we'd only have 1 pound here, right? And now what is 10% of 1? It's 0.1, right? So boom, and then boom. What happens in an ecosystem why there's nothing bigger than a shark? It's not because can't be anything bigger than a shark. It's that anything larger than that would use so much energy to get so little energy because there's so few sharks available. So things that eat great white sharks don't exist because there's so few great white sharks in the first place. So it would take it forever to go out and actually find another great white shark, eat it, get all that energy, and then it would turn around and have to go find another one. It would run out of gas before that. The distance between gas stations is too great. So you just can't have a vehicle that big in that kind of an ecosystem. The density of life is too low, basically. So a better way to show this as an example would be looking at marine ecosystems and scaling it, right? And scaling it. And what I mean by scaling it is this. We're going to back up and look at this. So here, this is a more of a better model because it shows it to scale. At the base, you have your primary producers. And let's say you have 1,000,000 kilograms of phytoplankton, right? Or 1,000,000 kilograms if we were to go on land of grass. That's only going to produce 100,000 kilograms then of herbivores, so you can see the scale to size. And farmers know this. People that run farms know this, that you have to have a lot more space available for your animals than you do animals themselves. You can't have an equal number. You can't put that many cows on that big of a field and have it be, a 1-to-1 ratio. So they will just decimate it. Producers won't be able to keep up. There won't be enough energy for them anyway. You still have to add feed to cows. And people that manage other animals know this too. So this modeling is incredibly important when we're looking at wanting to manage things like elk populations. You need to have enough real estate, right, for them to feed on to keep the population at a certain level. If you want to increase it, you got to increase the real estate. And if an elk population starts to go down, then you need to look at either disease, right, or habitat destruction, right, or replacement. We've introduced things like fire in certain ecosystems to promote the growth of grasses and things like that, which elk feed on, and that can increase the population. In streams and fisheries, right, baby salmon are higher up, right? They're eating insects that are in the stream that are herbivores, or maybe they're even up here eating insects that eat other insects. And so in order to have a healthy salmon population, you really need to have a big, huge base of a healthy stream down in here that is producing lots of these little insects for them. And out in the ocean, it's the same thing. When you affect the phytoplankton, you affect big things like larger fish, like tuna, like halibut, like rockfish, and all these other things. And shark populations around the planet, right, are a great example of reflecting what is going on here. Shark populations across the planet are 90% in decline pretty much across the board. So that's a pretty amazing number. There's around close to 500 species of shark in the world today that exist, and across the board, 90% declines globally. And it's because we are hammering the oceans. We've hammered them initially with overfishing and pollution, and we're still overfishing the oceans dramatically. Now, in this country, we regulate it. We have a very science-based approach to this, and we have very sustainable fisheries that we try and manage along our coastline, and we're getting better and better at this all the time. I think everybody would be in agreement that it has become sustainable. But internationally and globally, we still have some huge problems there with these big boats taking in lots of fish. And there goes the Coast Guard. Speaking of the coast, you can hear the helicopter. I'm going to keep talking, even though that might be a little bit distracting. Whatevs. So anyway, changes that we see up in here in numbers or in biomass are often indicative of actual changes going on down in here. And as a seabird biologist, when I worked with seabirds, that was what we looked at. We looked at seabird populations, which generally they are up in here in the trophic levels, and we monitored them to monitor what was going on down in here, because it was easier. We could be on an island, and I could look at birds that fed in hundreds of square miles area around the island. And so they were great indicators of multiple different things that were going on in the ocean. And we had 30 years worth of data that we could compare and look at and see changes in the marine ecosystem reflected in the things going on higher up in the ecosystem. Why do these numbers get lower? Because energy is transferred and lost. Energy is used and consumed. About 90% is used at each level and 10% is transferred, and so you run out. Why don't you have things bigger than a shark? It's not because there aren't things that can't eat a shark that aren't big enough. It's because there's just no more energy for anything up here, right? You can't have a tiny little needle up here because the population would be so low they wouldn't even be able to find each other to breed. Okay, I think I have covered that in an excruciating amount of detail. Woo! So go ahead and use that to fill out your note sheet this week. That should be helpful. And we'll have a quiz on this at the end of the week, on top of having a quiz on the different levels of ecological organization, populations and communities and things like that, ecosystems, ecology, and then the different abiotic factors, right? What are the 4 abiotic factors that shape and influence biological communities and really individual organisms and populations as well? And we'll take that on Friday. I'll post that, and have a great week, everybody.